Today marks our third event of a week-long celebration of film, art, and literature from Pakistan. We started off with the screening of Lal Kabootar, a movie that has been selected to represent Pakistan at the Oscars. It was a pre-booked, sold-out event followed by a Q&A with the producer and actor Ahmed Ali Akbar. Ahmed just recently won the Best Actor Award at the South Asian Festival in Washington, D.C. So it was a wonderful event. And those of you who were there, thank you so much for attending. We followed that with a lecture from the Chief Curator of the Lahore Fort Museum, Mr. Anjum Javed. He gave a fascinating insight into the history of Lahore and of the many artifacts that reside within the museum. We are lucky today to round off the week with a conversation with Fatima Bhutto. Thank you for your tremendous response and your support for braving traffic on a Friday evening. Before we start, the Board of Pakistan Arts Council wants to thank from the bottom of our hearts Yasmin and Salim Bhai for your generosity and kindness in offering your house so that we could accommodate this large of an audience. Thank you, Nuria, for co-sponsoring the event. You all really are wonderful, amazingly generous people. Thank you so much. Thank you, Azhar and Euceph Bhai, for your help with the audiovisual equipment and setup. I want to thank Rahima Shoaib also for alerting us about Fatma's book tour in the US. And because of her, Fatma is here with us today. We are honored to have Dr. Sheila Memon here as well. She is the wife of our Council General Jabbar Memon. Thank you, Sheila, for coming as well. Thank you. And last but not least, the entire board of Pakistan Arts Council, those present and those absent as well, for being the backbone of our organization. You are all indispensable. Can you please stand up to be recognized? They're already standing up. So we are very lucky to have Misha Euceph here with us. She will be conducting the interview. She is a remarkable young lady, a podcast host and producer. Her podcast, Tell Them I Am, is one of Time's best podcasts of 2019. So Misha, over to you.
It'll work now. How are you guys doing? Are you excited for tonight? Can we get a huge round of applause for the Pakistani Arts Council? Many of you might have thought I was maybe a painter or an astronaut, but no, I am just a podcast host, and I am very fortunate and excited to be here with Fatima Bhutto tonight. Fatima is a writer with bylines in The Guardian, The News, and many other publications. She was born in Kabul, but grew up in Syria and Pakistan. And as an author, she's written 5 books, including the nonfiction Songs of Blood and Sword, The Shadow of the Crescent Moon, and her novel, The Runaways. She's been longlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. Today, she's here to talk to me about her newest book, New Kings of the World, Dispatches from Bollywood, Dizi, and K-pop. I'm so excited to welcome Fatima Bhutto.
Thank you, Misha, for being here and for being in conversation with me. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. It's so nice to see so many friendly and familiar faces. Thank you to the Pakistan Arts Council for hosting this event. And thank you to our very gracious hosts for inviting us into their home tonight. Nuria and I go back. We were counting how many years, and it's too large, so I won't tell you how many. We're very young. Anyways. But Nuria was one of the first friends I made in school when we returned to Karachi in the early 90s, so it's very nice to be here with her today.
Do you want to switch mics?
I don't know, is it sounding funny?
Yeah, why don't you just use this one?
It's okay.
Was it fine?
Are you sure?
It sounds like a little broken.
It's a little broken.
We'll just go back and forth.
We can go back and
Okay.
forth. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to read you a small section from New Kings of the World, and then Misha and I will talk to each other with this one mic.
Yeah,
So, perfect.
Easy.
So I obviously chose this reading specifically for you tonight. And this is a book about the rise of Asian cultures and about the decline of the American century, and part of the reason that the American century is in decline is because of a swift rise of many cultural industries in Asia, but I want to read you a little bit about Pakistan. In 1977, Pakistan was placed under martial law. Seemingly overnight, the socialist progressive direction that the young country had been charting since the tumultuous start of that decade was blocked. General Zia-ul-Haq, the CIA-backed fundamentalist dictator, imposed his writ on all levels of Pakistani society. All political activity was banned, activists were publicly flogged, and barbarous edicts calling for the stoning of women were signed into law. Pakistan's new military ruler attempted to subjugate all facets of the Pakistani imagination to his total control, brutalizing society with a combination of violence and blanket repression. Newspapers were forced to submit to twice daily censorship checks, and those of you who were in Pakistan at the time will remember that newspapers refused to submit to those checks. So when the censor would block out stories in the paper, they would go to print with empty pages. So you would open up a newspaper and there would be 2 stories and then just white. So then the censors said, this is now against the law, you have to fill space with content. So they started to print pictures of donkeys. The same general who had called for thieves to have their hands amputated was so offended by women dancing that at one point he even outlawed public performances of classical dance in Pakistan. Yet it was exactly under this martial law's suffocating oppression that the arts in Pakistan were at their most vibrant and exciting. The artist Ijazul Hasan painted his famous New Year's bouquet, a noose of barbed wire in an empty vase, after he had been arrested by the junta, tortured, and then subjected to a mock execution. The journalist and playwright Imran Aslam wrote Khalij, a television serial about labor unions, the excesses of elite rule, and socialism. The poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz penned his most searing verse against the army from exile in Beirut. PTV broadcast Anghan Thera in the 1980s, 12 episodes of biting satire. In one famous episode, a servant is trying to learn English. What is the interrogative of "I am coming," he asks his boss. Is it "army going"? By the time the military censors got the joke, it was too late. Everybody else already had. Between the 1970s and 1980s, playwrights scripted television dramas and satires that traveled not only to the United Kingdom and to Canada, but they were also runaway successes across the border in India. Pakistan had always been an enthusiastic Bollywood audience, but when it came to television, there was no doubt that the Pakistanis bested their neighbors.
Before I get started, just a reminder, there will be a book signing at the end of the event, and it'll be in the back. And also, please turn off your phones, just out of respect. So I want to go kind of way back to your beginnings of your relationship with pop culture. Pop culture is often passed down to us by people in our lives, sometimes parents, siblings. What's something that you, as a kid, remember being one of your first pieces of pop culture that you attached yourself to?
Well, I grew up in Damascus in Syria, and I remember at the time never watching Syrian TV, but my father was a great fan of James Bond movies, so we watched a lot of that. And then he would get videos of Bollywood films, which for him were very nostalgic. And so even though we were far away from both those poles, we somehow existed somewhere in between them. And at the same time, my father listened to Sindhi folk music. So in the car, we would have Ho Jamalo on. And so we kind of existed in this multicultural universe, even when we were disconnected in other ways, in exile from our country.
And one of the things you've talked about before is how when you were in Syria, there were certain goods and foods that were impossible to get, but it was easy to consume certain forms of pop culture, and not just American pop culture, but global pop culture, right?
Yeah, at the time that I was growing up in Syria, it was a quite closed society, and if Syria didn't make it, you couldn't buy it, you couldn't find it. And even as I grew older, things sort of changed. So I remember there was a pizza place in Damascus called Pizza Hut. There was KFC, but it was Kuwaiti fried chicken. And at the same time, somehow we managed to survive. So there was always achar in the fridge. I don't know where we found achar from, but we found it. And you know, you had American music that you got on those little tapes. We had episodes of whatever show was happening at that time. And so culture always sneaks through. I think it's impossible to put up a checkpoint that's strong enough to stop people from connecting to other people and searching out their stories.
You've talked about going to the Kalash Valley.
Oh, yeah.
And that's an example of culture seeping through. Will you tell us a little bit?
Yes. Have any of you been to the Kalash Valley? Okay. Yeah. Hina has. So only one person. So me and Hina can explain it to you later. But it's very, very north in Pakistan. So for most of the year, for 9 months of the year, you can't access the Kalash Valley. You can only get there between May and August, I think. And you fly to Chitral, and then from Chitral you have to drive. The roads are terrible. So it's really like, it's a rough road in the best of circumstances. But the Kalash Valley is where they say that Alexander the Great's troops mutinied after the disastrous India campaign. So Alexander the Great, who conquered half the world, couldn't conquer India. He failed dramatically. And his troops mutinied in that valley, in that area, and they stayed behind and married locals and settled. And so the Kalasha people follow a kind of mix of a Greek religion that follows the seasons and the harvest. They look very unusual. They have blonde hair and blue eyes, and they're a matriarchal society. So it's the women that run everything, and you almost never see the men. When you do, they're pretty pointless. They don't have anything to add to the conversation. And
not that different from
and so what you see, the women are very unique in their dress. So they wear these beautiful, they're not really shalwar kameez, but they're kind of shalwar kameez. They're embroidered. Their hair is half shaved, half braided. And they are the ones also who support the family by making handicrafts and selling them. What's very unique about the Kalash Valley is that they're completely cut off. So there's no electricity, there's no internet, there's no cell phone service, there's no refrigerator, there's nothing. So when you want something to drink, there'll be bottles of water or Pepsi in the stream. That's how they keep the drinks cool. Their language is distinct. They're really quite incredible. And so I had gone to write about the Kalasha people for the news and Jung, who I was writing for at the time. And one of the women elders was taking me around and showing me the community, and she said, would you like to see where the women work, where they do the handicrafts that we sell? And she took me to this little cabin, and there were these women working there, and they were weaving and beading, and there's no lights, so again, it's dark. And as we walked in and I was looking around, I noticed, and again, by the way, looms, I don't mean electrical sewing machines, obviously, because there's no electricity, but there was a photograph of Shah Rukh Khan on the wall. And so I asked them, I said, who's this? And they were being a little coy, we don't know, I don't know, it's just a picture. But they had clearly seen his film somehow. And I kept asking them, they wouldn't tell me how, but he managed even to get to the Kalash Valley, frankly. and Shah Rukh Khan's family, of course, his father's family comes from Peshawar. So if you go to Peshawar today, Raj Kapoor's family comes from, Raj Kapoor grew up even in Peshawar. But Shah Rukh's father lived there. And in those days, he was a freedom fighter fighting against the British. And he was a part of the Quit India movement, and he worked with Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who's known as Frontier Gandhi. And so he has this part of his heritage that people forget. Now we're two separate countries and we're often, unfortunately, at odds, but we share so many things, even this legacy.
You know, what's interesting to me are the specific things that you chose to focus on in your book. And one of my favorite forms of television that has kind of seeped into my world now are telenovelas. Partly because in American pop culture it's starting to kind of gain traction again with adapted versions like Jane the Virgin, which, have you seen it? It's great. A little bit like my real life right now. But I'm curious why something like that didn't make it into your book, and how you chose Dizi's and K-pop and Bollywood instead.
Well, what I found that was really interesting is that if you look at, let's say, the 1980s, wherever you were in the world, you were watching American movies and American TV and listening to American music. There was almost nothing else except your national music, but international, you had American and nothing else. Every once in a while the British snuck through with the Beatles, or the French came up with someone, but that was it pretty much. And actually that's not the same case today. So when you are in a Syrian refugee camp, they're not watching Jane the Virgin, they're not watching Law and Order, they're not watching Avengers, whatever number they're on now. But what they are watching Bollywood. And they are watching Turkish shows. And that's true not just in Asia, but that's true in South America, that's true in Africa. And I think part of it is the changing face of the world. So there's several reasons that I write about in the book. The first is that a country who exercises soft power, which is of course supposed to be the opposite of hard power or military power, is that country is seen as credible. If you don't believe that country, you can't suspend your imagination long enough to really watch their shows. And America's always been incredibly sophisticated. Even when American power has been violent and brutal, the face of America has always been one of liberty, one of brotherhood, one of freedom.
Denim jeans.
Jeans, exactly, rock and roll, all that stuff. That's not the case now. Things have changed. And secondly, of course, is migration. Something like 1 billion people have moved in recent years. And of that billion people, a tiny minority is moving to other countries. The majority, which is some 700 million people, are moving internally within their own countries. They're going from rural homes into the city. And if you imagine Pakistan in this respect, but almost anywhere in the world, you can put the same exercise in Mexico, let's say. When you go from a rural environment where you live with your family, people who you know, people who help you, where credit is done on bonds, not on collateral capital, and you then find yourself in the city where suddenly you're faceless and you're invisible and nobody knows you and it's transactional. And if you don't have enough, you simply cannot survive. The hundreds of millions of people who find themselves in this new turbulent world don't see their stories in American culture. So if they go to the movies in the brief time they have, what are they watching? You know, they don't see people who look like them in the screens. They don't see people who live like them. They don't see their failures reflected in those movies or TV shows, and they don't see their dreams. And Hollywood's attempts to capture this audience are pretty sad. You know, Crazy Rich Asians, you know, out of the, 2.5 billion people who live in Asia, you chose to tell the story of like
rich Singaporeans.
Yeah. Like not even 1%. So those people, who are they looking at? They're looking actually at the Turks and the Indians for the most part. And in the book I wrote about mass culture. So of course the Iranians are making amazing films. And of course Pakistani television dramas are still very sophisticated, but that's high culture. So that's a more elite culture in a way, because it requires more of you as an audience member. But
were there things that were on your short list that,
yes.
that didn't make it into
Yes.
the book?
So when I submitted my proposal for the book, I also wanted to include Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, because they're actually incredibly far ahead in the world in terms of streaming. So, we're sitting in America, we're sitting in California, you guys will watch Netflix or Prime, right? But maybe one or two other things, but it's mainly those two. But the Nigerians have way more options. I mean, they've got, the Netflix upon Netflix upon Netflix that are watched by hundreds of millions of people. all across Africa, and Nigerians in the diaspora, Nigerians at home, Ghanaians. So I wanted to write about that, but that got cut. And then I also wanted to write about IPL cricket. You'll see when you read the book that I managed to squeeze in some cricket. And I wanted to write about IPL because it's the first time that you see a sport franchised in that way. So of course there's the NBA and the NFL, but the IPL was a new attempt at that, at taking essentially a sport only played by Commonwealth countries and trying to make it global. And then obviously as a Pakistani, I have a vendetta to pick because Pakistani players are not in the IPL. But that got cut because it got cut because it's still mainly us lot who are watching it. So it's not really Swedish people watching IPL. And the remit of New Kings of the World was to talk about truly global products.
Why were you fascinated by Turkish television and Dizi specifically?
I'm guessing everybody here has seen a Turkish television drama. It would be faster to ask who hasn't.
Yeah, raise your hands.
Yeah, okay. So the Turkish phenomena is really interesting, and I'll address only the 5 people who put their hands up who haven't seen it. The Turkish phenomena is very interesting because, just for reference, I'll put it this way: The Bold and the Beautiful, which of course is an American soap opera that many of you will remember watching on Star TV in the 1990s. At its peak, it had been watched by 26 million people globally. Mira Sultan, or Magnificent Century, at its peak, has been watched by over 500 million people.
Wow.
So that's really why I chose it, because when the Turkish craze hit Pakistan, I noticed that it was there in the background, but I wasn't watching it. But I noticed that suddenly people were not available between the hours of 8:30 and 9:30. Shops would close, friends wouldn't answer their phones. And I noticed it, but I thought this was just in Pakistan, because of course Pakistan and Turkey have a very strong relationship and a long historical bond. And then as I was traveling, I started to notice it wasn't just Pakistan, it was all over. So it's really big in Chile, for example. It's big in Mexico. It's very big in Eastern Europe, so in Russia it's big. And so when I started to notice that, then it was on my horizon. So when I was looking at who are the Asian countries giving America a run for their money, Turkey was up there.
Why do you think it has such mass appeal?
It has mass appeal because it's incredibly sophisticated. It's incredibly well done. So if you watch an episode of, I don't even know what's the soap opera in American, like is it All My Children or 100 Lives, or what are they called? Okay. Whatever, let's just say The Bold and the Beautiful. So The Bold and the Beautiful, in one episode, there's an earthquake, then the mother divorces the father, then the father finds out he was never married to his wife but her sister, then the son falls down a cliff, and then the wife has a baby that she didn't know. But the Turkish shows are not like that. They're very nuanced. They are based on literary classics. They're written by incredibly well-respected scriptwriters, and they cover anything from Ottoman sultans to modern-day dramas. Each episode is 2 hours and 15 to 20 minutes long. When you watch Mera Sultan or any of these other shows, they cut them. They make them 45 minutes. But in Turkey, if you watch it on Netflix, they also cut them, I think, to 45 minutes. But it's 2 hours and 20 minutes. And imagine that they keep you watching for 2 hours. And when it ends, those 2 hours, they leave you waiting for more.
Wow.
So they're well done. The production value is very high. So when I was in Turkey, I spoke to a lot of people who were involved in the shows. And I asked them, what is the popularity? One of the other reasons is that they're very modern, but based on traditional morality and ethics. So there are things that you can watch with your whole family. You can watch them with your parents, with your children, with your brothers. There's nothing offensive in the shows. And then they're also about us, really, in a way. So there are people who have lives like us, who have families like us. When you have a Muslim king in a Turkish show, he's a just king. He's a noble, dignified king. He's a tolerant king. And we've been so badly portrayed, not just as Muslims, but also as Asians. You know, when you see somebody with your skin tone in a Hollywood film, he's a bad guy. He's not doing anything good. But the Turks have flipped that, and it's why they're popular in Asia, it's why they're popular in South America. It's because we see ourselves reflected in their stories.
Talk to me about K-pop. What I found really interesting in your book is how you talk about K-pop as an investment from the Korean government in its power.
Yes. So Korea is really futuristic when it comes to pop culture. They were thinking about it seriously before anyone else was. So when the 1997 financial crisis hit Asia, Korea was very badly hit, and they had to take out, at that time, what was the largest IMF bailout in history. And it was very humiliating for them. And Korea, because of the war, because of their mutual defense pacts with North America, cannot invest in military technology. They have no natural resources to speak of. I mean, they have ginseng, but you're not going to build, you know, an economic powerhouse on ginseng. And at the same time, they had these big industrial behemoths like Samsung and Hyundai, but that hadn't saved them from being hit by the crisis, so they knew they couldn't rebuild relying on Samsung and Hyundai. So the president at that time was a man named Kim Dae-jung, and he was inspired by Andrew Lloyd Webber's musicals and by Hollywood's big films. And he was inspired because pop culture requires no organizational infrastructure. It only needs talent and time. So as early as the late 1990s, South Korea starts to invest in the internet. They lay the country with broadband. Back then, I mean, when the rest of us had dial-up, they had broadband. By 2015, any South Korean internet connection is 200 times faster than the average American internet connection. And they put a lot of money into the cultural industries. And by cultural industries, I mean movie, I mean TV, I mean video games. I don't know if the young kids have left us. Have they run away and gone home? They're still here? So they're one of the leaders of video games. K-pop brings in $5 billion a year. Video games brings in over 1,000 times that to Korea. So if you're a gamer, then South Korea is an interesting place for you to watch as a young person. And what they do is they also instruct their cultural ministries to think about the world. So they issue them manuals on how to spread Korean culture with little factoids, but that are kind of obvious. So if you're going to put a TV drama in the Middle East, it shouldn't air during prayer times, you know, and they tell them when those are. So they were thinking about that way before anyone else. Now, if you've been watching the news lately, you will see that after the most recent gathering at the UN, Pakistan's Prime Minister announced that Pakistan, Malaysia, and Turkey are going to come together to put a TV channel together. Okay, but they're doing this in 2019. The South Koreans were doing it in 1997.
Wow.
So this is also something that's happening with Bollywood. And I want to get into the specifics of the current government a little bit later, but why do you think Bollywood is seeping into Hollywood just now in such a big way?
Well, Bollywood is interesting because Bollywood, it's not that they were trying necessarily, but part of the reason Bollywood was so popular, and they were popular, I mean, not now, they've been popular for a long time, is because, for example, in the 1950s, Raj Kapoor's films were being watched in Peru. So when I went to Peru for New Kings of the World, I met people who told me that they were watching Mother India in the 1960s in cinemas. And it was the Peruvians who had come from the highlands. Again, it's that same story. People who leave their homes in the village to come work in the city. And those people who were working in people's homes, who felt invisible generally, would go to the movies and watch Raj Kapoor's films.
I was going to ask you actually to read a passage about that, will you?
Shall I read that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think page 99. I think it starts with Peru's love affair with
Oh,
Bollywood.
can I read the bit about Mother India?
Yeah, go for it. Read Richard.
So just to let you know, and then we'll come back to talking more about it.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'll do it before since I forget and I'm so jet lagged. They also were very big in the Soviet Union, and they were big because they were ideologically safe, those films. So when the Cold War was at its height, They could still watch Raj Kapoor films because they were enjoyable, entertaining. Joseph Stalin, by the way, was a big fan of Raj Kapoor. And they were not Western. So they were allowed. In the battle between East and West, they were considered acceptable. So Peru, which has a huge amount of Bollywood fans, all those fans, again, are people who are indigenous Peruvians. They look like us. They could be Dizis, actually. The skin coloring, the face, all of it looks like us. And then, of course, there's a part of Peru that comes from European ancestry. They are not watching Bollywood. They don't even know it exists. But among the fans, they don't call it Bollywood, they call it Cines Hindu. And just to make you see how funny the translations work, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham in Peru is known as La Familia Hindu. Peru began its tryst with Indian cinema, or Cines Hindu as it's known, in the early 1950s. Unlike other markets where Bollywood is popular, Egypt or Nigeria, for example, Peru has neither historic ties with India nor an NRI population. Until 1963, the two countries didn't even have diplomatic relations. 56 years later, there still hasn't been any significant bilateral business or political cooperation between India and Peru. Though the Indian steel conglomerate Tata has set up shop in 2010 and trade is set to grow, the momentum is relatively slow. According to the Indian embassy, no more than 400 Indians live in the entire country. Two films, 1954's Mendigar o Morir, Boot Polish, and the 1957 classic Madre India, or Mother India, kicked off Lima's love affair with Bollywood. At the time, there were two cinema halls that showed Indian films regularly, City Hall and Metropolitan. Not only were the Bollywood classics instant blockbusters, but Madre India was screened especially on Mother's Day, wow, as well as during Holy Week. You can understand Mother's Day, Professor Ricardo Bedoya, Peru's most eminent film critic, told me. But what's interesting is that during Semana Santa, or Holy Week, people here feel that you don't go to the movies to have a good time, but to suffer. I suffer when I watch Bollywood, actually, so I understand. But to feel empathy with the suffering of Christ. It was mainly poorer limeños who flocked to these cinema halls, migrant laborers and women who had left their homes in the Andean highlands to come and work in the capital. The films are easy to understand, they don't condescend to their audiences, and they're built around the nobility of suffering and the valor of the poor and the dispossessed. And I saw that even with young Peruvians today in Lima. Everyone I met was from a struggling background. They were people who lived on the outskirts of the city. You know, they had no access to travel or to, consumer goods. And what they told me again and again was that they felt, as people who were poor, as people who were struggling to survive, that they were invisible. That if they watched a Hollywood film, the same thing. They were the criminals in the film, even if they watched Peruvian films. But when they watched Bollywood, they understood that you can wear your native dress and still be modern, that you can move in the world and people respect you, that you can be a part of the global tide and not be white or Western. And it was very moving, actually, to see that.
It's interesting because I feel like a lot of what you've talked about with all of these forms of pop culture is that class actually plays more of a role than anything, that it allows people to feel represented within their social classes. Hugely,
I think, and especially if you look at the older Bollywood films. So today there's a lot of consumerism in Bollywood films and a lot of flash and glitz, but even that was acceptable because when they watched a Hollywood film, it was unattainable. The person lives in New York, they're white, they speak English, obviously they can have that life. But when they watch Bollywood, it was exciting because if a brown man can make that happen for him, maybe you can too.
How do you reconcile the desire to consume other types of culture through, all these global forms of pop culture, with the fact that these are often national propaganda pieces.
Yeah.
How do you both appreciate other cultures and also be aware of what you're consuming?
Yeah. So Misha and I were discussing this earlier, and I think we come to culture very innocently. We come wanting to be entertained, wanting to forget our troubles. But of course, culture is not made that way. It's made with messages, with coded political agendas. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't watch those products, but it means we should know what we're getting into. Now, if you look into America, let's say, it's not just recently that there are political messages in American films. Walt Disney was an avid propagandist. So during World War II, Walt Disney was making Donald Duck fight the Nazis in cartoons. He was involved very heavily in propaganda. Again, during the Cold War, one of the things that the Soviets did, that the Russians did, is they understood that segregation and the way that African Americans treated was a sensitive spot for America. So they would put a lot of news out about the civil rights movement, about how hard it was for African Americans to survive here. So Hollywood, to counter that, would put well-dressed African Americans in Hollywood films. Well, even before that, even when they were not the main actors, they would be, let's say a ballroom scene in a 1950s Hollywood film, and there would be somebody who's African American in the party, as though he was allowed to be in the party in real life, when of course he wasn't. So there's always been propaganda in film. If you look at the 1980s, the example I love to give is if you watch the original Rambo 3, Rambo 2, it's dedicated, it says, this film is dedicated to the brave fighters of the Mujahideen. Now, when they became the Taliban, then they had to change that and make it the brave people of Afghanistan. But there's always been propaganda. And it's just, Hollywood has been really good at glossing over it. Bollywood is not as good, let's say, or Lollywood is not as good. But I think we should watch whatever we want to watch, but we should think about who's making it for us.
Yeah.
The word you used earlier was be discerning.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, be discerning. The CIA has an arm that deals with movies. They have a website, like you can just Google it and go onto their website, and they've got a web page that says, are you making a film? Do you need the CIA's help? We can read your script and advise you. And they do that, and they've done it to films that you've watched and enjoyed. So Argo, if you saw the film Argo, that had their help. If you saw Zero Dark 30, that had a lot of help. They gave them a lot of advice on how to make that film. If you watch American Sniper, I don't know why you would watch American Sniper, but if you did by accident, watch it by accident, they helped that film too. And we have to be discerning. Even when we watch, just to give you American Sniper, for example, there's an awful scene, and by the way, the guy who wrote the book, who it's based on, says awful things about Muslims in his book. He uses the dirtiest language to describe Iraqis and Muslims, really pejorative language, and says, I didn't mind killing them, they were in my way, I had to kill them. Now, when Hollywood makes that film, they make him a hero. And part of what they do, what film does, is it aligns your sympathy where it wants, depending on who the camera's facing. So there's a terrible scene in that film where the guy, whatever his name is he's a sniper, and he's lying down on a roof or whatever it is, and he's looking through the gun sight. And around the corner below, there's an Iraqi child. So what does that tell us? That even children are terrorists in Iraq, And there's this Iraqi child, and he's picking up a grenade launcher, as children do every day, And the American sniper is talking to himself, and he's saying, don't do it. And he's he's sweating. He doesn't want to shoot the child, but he has to, And then eventually the kid drops the thing and runs away, and he almost has a heart attack out of relief not to kill the child. But if you read his book, he loves killing Iraqi children. He has no problems. He really doesn't. So that's what film does. It allies your sympathy wherever it wants.
So it's interesting because it's not just prevalent in Hollywood, right? You talk a lot about Bollywood, specifically with the Modi government, and how someone like Akshay Kumar has like screened his films for Modi ahead of time.
Yeah. Akshay Kumar has been in numerous films that are based on Modi kind of agendas. Akshay Kumar is, I'm not saying it as a Pakistani. Many Indian film critics have said Akshay Kumar is the poster boy for this government. And here's the best part. Akshay Kumar is a Canadian citizen. Wow. He's not even an Indian national. And he is sort of lecturing people on what it means to be a good citizen. So film is powerful. We are led away by film. When you're reading a book, it hurts me to say this as a writer, but when you're reading a book and then the phone rings, you put the book down. You get distracted. You're listening to the radio and then you get out of your car. But film for those 2 hours has your complete attention. That's very powerful, and it can be very dangerous.
This is why everyone should listen to podcasts.
Yes, exactly. And read books.
Not endorsing ourselves at all. So I really do take pride in being an American, and ever since I have been here, I have felt that American pop culture, as tricky as it can be, it does try and over time succeed in representing its population at the time. So when it was, Italian immigrants and German immigrants and Jewish immigrants, it was reflecting those realities. And now, even despite all the controversy in Hollywood, we are starting to represent stories of people who look like me, even if some of those stories are crazy rich Asians. Do you see that positive momentum, forward movement in American pop culture?
Well, it's interesting, Misha, because you're not the first American who said that to me. I did a podcast, in fact, with someone of Iranian origin, and he said the same thing. He said, but now they're doing it in everything. There's a lot of representation. But as a non-American, I would say I think it's too little, too late. I think it's too little, too late. I think it's not enough. It's tokenistic to just put one Asian American into a show, and now Asian Americans should feel as though that's it, they've been seen. I think it's too little, too late to have, one person who might be of South Asian origin who has a show. It can't possibly represent everything. And why would you watch something that's got one measly character when you can just go watch, a Korean film or an Iranian film or any other film? And again, the example I keep giving lately is this Ethiopian refugee drama that's being made, and the main protagonist is a white woman. So, even Ethiopian refugee dramas cannot be told just through the story of Ethiopian people. Now it has to have a white actress in it. And I think, unfortunately, that they've been too slow. And I think because they've been too slow, they're going to miss out. So even if you're watching Netflix, what are you watching on Netflix? You're watching Narcos? Right.
Actually, Netflix has a lot of Desi comedians.
That's right. So you have a lot of, exactly. But so you're watching things about other people, not an American show with one of those other people as a character. I think they will struggle. I think they're going to try. But I think it's a strange moment. So today Martin Scorsese said about Avengers, it's not cinema. It's something else. And it's a fascinating moment because for the first time they have serious competition from a lot of places.
So what's crazy to me is even though American television and film is getting more and more competition, and even music, that America still controls the platforms. We were talking earlier about Instagram and Facebook, and even Netflix or Hulu, Amazon Prime, those are American transnational corporations. Yeah. So there is still some sort of hold,
There is, but I think the hold is loosening. So if we just look at YouTube, for example, which is another huge platform, again, American, out of the top 10 most viewed videos on YouTube, 6 are South Korean. Wow. YouTube didn't even know that their videos could be watched more than 1 billion times until Gangnam Style. It was because of Gangnam Style they had to reset all their counters. And again, you might think, that's, it's all South Koreans watching it. No, 80% of those views are coming from outside of South Korea. The most tweeted about celebrities or anything on Twitter was BTS 2 years ago. So the platforms might still be American, but the attention is not on America. The attention is shifting. And I think that's exciting, why not? You know, when I was in Turkey, I spoke to the man whose studio made Magnificent Century. And he was saying to me, he was telling me about a new show that they had in production, which I went to see, called Söz, which means the oath, and it's a military drama. And it was like very Turkish, you know, very Turkishly nationalistic, about Turkish soldiers and Turkish all this stuff. And I said to him, okay, Magnificent Century was about the Ottomans, but it was also about Muslims, and it was also about Asia and the conquest of Europe, and so that was obviously watched by many people. But who's gonna watch shows about a Turkish military, you know, about Turkish soldiers? And he said to me, he said, look, I had to grow up watching God Bless America dramas. Now it's time that people watch God Bless Turkey dramas. And it's a fair point, actually.
So I'm going to end our questions in just a second, but before we do, I want you to give a recommendation to everybody of what they should maybe watch or consume.
Yes.
Okay.
Once they leave.
I would say that one of the most interesting things that I watched was a Turkish Dizi called Çukur, and it's a remake of The Godfather. And I think Godfather 1 and 2 are some of the greatest films ever made. And you know, Mario Puzo, when he wrote the book The Godfather, and Francis Ford Coppola, when he made the films, both understood that they were not talking about crime. They were talking about capitalism. So Godfather 1 and 2 is a great parable of capitalism in America. If you look at it with that light, you'll see so many new things in it. And Çukur is a remake, and it's set in a neighborhood in Istanbul that was a Greek Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, and they film on the ground, in the middle of the city, actually. They use the locals as extras, they renovated homes and use it for their sets. And I think it's really well done. It's really gripping. It was one of my favorite discoveries, doing all this.
And where can they watch it?
Oh, where can you watch it? It's not on Netflix, actually. You might have to try and get it on YouTube. There are episodes with English subtitles on YouTube. Yeah, Netflix keeps changing their roster. But Çukur is my favorite, yeah.
So we're going to open up to questions. Just another reminder, we're going to do the book signing after this. How are we passing around microphones?
Or you can just...
Or I guess you could just stand up and ask a question. So I'll pick people, just raise your hand. And one request that I have, which I make every time, is please don't talk forever about yourself. Just ask a question, let it end with the question mark would be great. Yes, in the back.
What's the opportunity, the global opportunity for Pakistani entertainment?
I think there is a lot of scope. So Humsafar is on Netflix. A lot of Pakistani dramas are on Netflix and have a global reach. I just did an event in London, and Mahira Khan came to do a reading, and Mahira was mobbed afterwards. Like, a lot of people came up to her because they'd seen her shows, and you know, there were some Indians in the audience who came and wanted to talk to her. I think drama has always been Pakistan's strong point, but you will have seen lately that we're making a lot of good movies too now. I mean, Lal Kabutar is one of the more recent ones. Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy is, you know, obviously the Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker. Zindabad. No, not a good film? Okay, sorry.
A lot of good.
Oh, there's a lot of good. There is. I think. Yeah, of course. I think there's a lot of. I think film is going to get better and better and better, but it's still a quite small industry, and TV is I think our strongest. And of course, music. You know, anywhere you go in the world, they're listening to Nusrat Fateh Ali. many places. So I think Pakistan's possibilities are endless. And I think it's really important Pakistan starts to push and support its arts, because it's a side of the country that we know about, but no one else does. And we have to start being proactive about it.
I also think, yes, please give her a round of applause.
No, but we're known for it. We're known for the 1980s. They were watching Pakistani shows in Trinidad and in Scotland. So why don't we reclaim it?
Yeah, I also think the diaspora has a huge responsibility to do that too, and to spread it at least, within the United States and in the Western world. I think a lot of us get to bogged down in our children being doctors and lawyers and are elevating the arts,
Yeah, it's very important. It's very important. This is a political project. This is not just a cultural project.
Absolutely.
It's about presenting our own stories ourselves. Because if our stories are told by other people, then we'll never be full people. And they do it badly. If they did it well, okay, fine, but
we have to help.
yeah. It's time. It's really time.
Other questions?
Okay.
Yes.
So Fatma, I want to ask you that what is the next biggest point that you wanted to make while you were writing this book? The first of it, as it seems to me, is that movies and any production which is visual, it carries a big...
Yeah.
Nobody can hear you. Okay.
So I just wanted to know that what is the next biggest point you were thinking of making when you were writing your book? The first that seems to me is that you wanted to talk about the fact that televising anything is the biggest medium of, having a cultural invasion and, people-to-people connections. So what was the next biggest point that you were thinking of making while writing this book?
That's a very good question. And for me, what was very important with this book is to talk about Asia and the power of Asia and how connected we all are. Those of us who don't live in America or who don't live in the West, we're always relegated to the second position or the third position. We're not given the same space. And actually, we are the biggest. We are the biggest countries in the world are in Asia. The fastest growing economies of the world are in Asia. Something like half of the world's population within a decade is going to be middle class, and 2/3 of that is going to come from Asia. So the future, if the last century was an American century, the coming century is going to be an Asian one. And I really wanted to talk about that. I wanted us to feel proud, actually, of that. And it's been really interesting for me just being in America and going around and doing these talks. People will say, we had no idea. We had no idea that this was happening. And I don't think it should threaten anyone. It's not a threatening thing. I think it's an exciting thing. I think it's exciting that even as the world becomes more paranoid and countries are trying to hold people within their borders and limit people to their nationalities, as human beings, we have no interest in doing that. As human beings, we're very open to other people's cultures, to other people's stories. And that to me is a very positive thing that I thought it was important, especially at this moment, to talk about. Yeah. So Trump actually, at the UN, President Trump said, in his speech, he spoke a lot against globalists. He said that this is not the century of globalists. And he was talking in favor of nationalists. But even as I was listening to it, I thought, it doesn't make sense anymore. It's exactly globalists to whom the future belongs. It's people who can connect, who can sympathize, who can understand, and who are not afraid of others that are going to triumph in the coming century.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think in a sense we are already globalized.
Yes, absolutely.
Not staying within the borders.
Absolutely.
Intellectually, physically.
And that's wonderful. I mean, to me it was so fascinating. I'll tell you a story. When I went to Iran in 2007, I went to write for the News and Jung again.
Why did you stop writing in the first place? Sorry.
Well, I'll tell you, I stopped writing because the government changed. And
You're not the kind of a person who will be scared.
No, I wasn't scared. The paper couldn't print it. So in any case, I went to Tehran to write about young people living in Iran and the revolution and how it was affecting young people. And Iranian films, as you know, are very popular and they're very well done. And in the West, they kind of got around to them recently. But there's a lot of great films. And I went to a DVD wala in Tehran and said, I had a local friend who had told me what to watch. And I asked him, do you have this movie? Do you have this movie? Do you have this movie? And he said, I don't have them yet. They're coming in. So I said, when will they come? And he said, well, the shipment should come from Karachi within the next 2-3 weeks. So, even then, the DVDs are coming from Karachi, and that was 12 years ago. In Peru, when I was meeting Bollywood fans, I met this wonderful person whose family was in carpentry. His father was a carpenter, he was a carpenter, but he just loved films, so he was involved in these film groups. And he was talking to me about Shahn's films. He knew about Shahn, he knew what he'd worked on, he'd seen Khuda Ke Liye, and he was giving me his commentary, and I thought, my God, even this far they're watching Pakistani films. So you're right, we're already global. It's too late to hold that back.
We're gonna ask another question in the back.
Yeah, I just want to say, I really appreciate all the things you said.
I really appreciate a lot of things you said. A lot of the ideas you said, they resonate with me. But my question is, what was your motivation for writing this book? Because a lot of people don't think the way you're thinking. So, how did that? What happened? What changed? And then you kind of chose to write this book.
Well, I've always been interested in pop culture, and so I always watch and listen with that kind of who is giving me this message in mind, that question. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy it, but I am wondering about that. And I suppose I started thinking about it a little more. I always thought about it, but I was asked a few years ago to give a talk to BAFTA, which is the British version of the Oscars, right? And they'd asked me to do a talk, and so I did a talk on cinema and propaganda. And I spoke specifically about how Muslims are viewed in Hollywood. And I brought clips with me, I used American Sniper, and I used Rambo, and I used all these things. And when I was talking to people, it occurred to me that people who are not Muslim had never thought about this before. That they really didn't think there was a problem. They thought that these were great movies, or there was no issue. And I suppose that kind of got me thinking, what do they think about us? Why do they think that it's acceptable for anyone to be portrayed in this sort of peripheral, objectivized way? So that was a little bit in my mind, but I've never believed the idea that the West is the center of the world. I just don't come from that kind of thinking. I've never accepted the idea that the West is the center. It just isn't. And they always, it's always portrayed that way, and it's not true. So my interest is always in trying to pull the direction back to other parts of the world and to what truly, it seems to me, is dynamic and unusual at any given time.
Yes, go ahead. They're going to bring a microphone to you, unless you can project.
Fatma, my question is that for the last 20 years, we've been pushing the cultural exchange between India and Pakistan to bring down the walls and have better friendship. What do you think, has that been effective, and how do we move forward with that?
I think in some ways, yes, it has been effective. I think one of the things is the traffic. So the traffic from India to Pakistan is there. So we watch Bollywood films, they're in our cinemas, we get the DVDs, we watch them in our homes. So Pakistanis have spent hours with Indians through their TVs, and that allows them to know that we're the same people. I think we understand that, really. But the traffic the other way is not as thick, it's pretty thin. So Pakistani dramas are very popular in India, and whenever I'm doing these kind of events, people will tell me, I met somebody, I think in Dizi, I was signing his book, and he said, my name was given to me, he was Indian, he said, because my mother was watching a drama and she loved the name, and he was in his sort of 20s. So it exists, but not widely. So they don't know very much about us. They don't know that we look like them, that we eat like them, that we talk like them, that we are essentially the same people. So those efforts should increase. And unfortunately, there's always something that gets in the way. But people-to-people contact is incredibly important. I mean, one of the most moving journeys I've ever made in my life was to cross Wagah. And when you fly to India from Pakistan, or you go from India to Pakistan, you're on a plane, you know, it's discombobulating, you don't really know what's going on. But when you walk through the same mustard field, and it's a difference of 3 steps that makes 2 countries, that's very painful.
Right.
You know, the Ravi River isn't cut by partition. You know, the water of the Ravi is in Amritsar, it's in the Golden Temple. Some of the most holy Sikh sites are in Nankana Sahib, is in Punjab. So that to me really made me feel that in fact the efforts have not gone far enough. There isn't enough people to people, and we really have to insist, and we have to be careful not to be led away against each other, whoever we are, wherever we are, whether it's India, Pakistan, or Pakistan, Bangladesh, or whoever. We have to work harder at reaching out and building bridges.
Especially between the people.
Especially between the people, of course.
Yeah.
We have a question in the back.
And then this one.
Oh, we have a question over there. That's my family, so not here.
So, yeah, Misha's father. You know, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you this.
Please give him a round of applause.
I think the premise of your book, basically, I haven't read the book, so you know, I'm assuming a lot of things. So I don't know what you. Yeah, please forgive me. But I think the premise of your book is that the American soft power is receding, and Asia is the rising star. Or stuff. Sometimes I fail to see that, because in terms of innovation, especially, I don't see much innovation, and I'm looking at culture from other angles also, not just television and film and stuff. Of course, music, you know, is very dear to me. The latest genre, for example, you know, the most popular genre to come out is hip hop. You know, it comes out of America. In food, you know, all the innovation is happening here. The organic movement, or the farm to table, or what have you. We are the ones who are still defining that. In social interaction, for example, you know, Instagram and Facebook and the iPhones, those are all happening from here. So I kind of fail to see that. But having said all of that, I think there's the biggest driving factor here is the effect of the language, the fact that we're here speaking in the English language. So how have you examined that particular aspect? You know,
Well, I'll try and answer all the points. I mean, you're right that the iPhone is innovated here, but guess where they make it? They can't make it without us. I'd like to see them make the iPhone in California. It wouldn't go down very well. In terms of food, I mean, Samin Nusrat is one of the leaders of food innovation. She comes from an Iranian background. She's here, but she's bringing our palettes and our flavors and our ideas also. She's moving them. In terms of organic, we've always been organic in Pakistan. Our food has always been farm to table. We don't have chemical pesticides. We've always had organic chicken. Desi murgi and all that stuff is Desi murgi we've done long before. So in that sense, you know, we have been a part of a lot of these things without commoditizing them or without branding them as our own.